Let me show you something from a behind-the-scenes clip from Terrence Malick's film Knight of Cups. A Rhodes Scholar and academic philosopher turned filmmaker, Malick made two critically acclaimed films in the 1970s before he disappeared unannounced from Hollywood for 20 years. Okay, what you're seeing here is very rare. Here we see Terrence Malick working on set. Since he's returned from his absence, he's forbidden his face from being used in any publicity for his films, and he's never spoken publicly unless he isn't being recorded. You can tell the person filming the behind the scenes knows they've made a mistake because as soon as Malick comes into the frame, they quickly pan over to hide him again. This means we don't have Malick himself as a direct source for why his style developed in a certain way and looks the way it does. But we can still learn a lot by examining what those who have worked with him have said, and by drawing conclusions from the relationship we see between his style and the thematic content of his work. The Tree of Life, Malick's most renowned film, juxtaposes an intimate story of family life in the 1950s against a sequence that showcases the creation of the universe on a cosmic scale. What Malick seems interested in is not just telling the story of individual characters, but situating these characters within a much broader context. Perhaps it is this same desire to situate characters within a broader context that led Malick to use wider lenses with deeper focus later in his career, a development that played a big role in shaping his specific look. With these wide lenses, even when the camera approaches a character for a close-up, they are always part of their environment, almost inseparable from the natural world that surrounds them. There's a certain kind of shot that is iconically Terrence Malick. It's probably one of these kinds of shots that springs to mind when I mention his name. These shots, like the films they are inside of, tend to provoke strong reactions. For some people, they're a suggestion towards something profound, the inclusion of something grander, a kind of visual poetry symbolizing things that lay beyond the frame. For others, they're a baffling distraction, an irrelevant, frustrating diversion from what the films are supposed to be doing, telling a story. This polarization between the people for whom this kind of thing resonates and the people who find it aggravating exists all around Terrence Malick, not just in response to his finished films, but among those who have worked with him in response to how he works. Some, like longtime collaborator and cinematographer Emmanuel Lubezki, find the way Malick works profound. He said, "Working with Terry has changed my life. I'm a different parent, I'm a different husband, and I'm a different friend. I see nature in a different way since I started working with Terry." Others, like James Horner, the composer for The New World, or Adrian Brody, who was initially cast as the lead for The Thin Red Line and then cut out of the film, express frustration and exasperation at his methods. But whether you love it or hate it, Malick's style is undeniably unique. This unique style is something that Malick's critics tend to disregard as extraneous and arbitrary, made up of choices that prioritize the pursuit of visual beauty at the expense of character and story. But far from being arbitrary, I think it's a unique style that developed organically alongside a unique approach, not just to filmmaking, but what a film can be. Even if you're not a fan of Malick's work, he's a filmmaker who's been incredibly influential. As I talked about in a recent video, he's been a major influence on Best Director Oscar winner Chloe Zhao for her work on Nomadland, and many other directors have been influenced significantly by his work. I think it's an interesting exercise to try to understand not just what this style is that's been so influential, but why it was developed in the way that it was.
His films are all very, very connected with each other, and they're very recognizably his work, but it's very tough to put your finger on why that is or what you're seeing in that. The technique is not immediately obvious.
To try to break down the technical elements that make up this style, let's start with these iconic Malick shots. While Malick's whole style isn't defined by these shots, breaking down these moments that feel stereotypically Malick is a good place to start. There are several easily identifiable elements we can find here. We see the use of natural light, the use of wide-angle lenses, and the deep focus that I mentioned at the beginning. But there's also a fairly unusual positioning of the camera or movement of the camera. It's generally lower to the ground than we expect to find in a film, and is often closer to the subject than we expect for this kind of wide-angle lens. The camera often looks upward in a way that's not often encountered in narrative film, and the way the camera moves is also significant to the construction of these shots. The camera movement is often very unmotivated and subjective. The movement isn't clearly motivated by the movement of objects in the frame, but the movement doesn't seem to be marking a specific emotional beat for the characters in the way a crash zoom often would. Instead, the camera seems to have a life of its own and interests of its own. Natalie Portman, talking about her work on Knight of Cups, described Lubezki and his Steadicam operator Jorg Widmer, who would go on to be Malick's cinematographer for A Hidden Life, as actors in the film. They are a part of the scene with you. You're dancing with them constantly, and you're acting with them personally. We can even see in the behind-the-scenes footage from Song to Song that at one point they just hand the camera over to Ryan Gosling and let him do some shooting. But it's not just the visual elements of a shot like this that make it stand out. It's how these shots are positioned and used inside the films that makes them unique. If used within a larger scene, they often push the scene away from linear continuity, breaking from the narrative of what's happening immediately around the characters. That these shots break away from the story being told isn't just something that appears in the final film, it's a reality of the way they're shot. Jack Fisk, the production designer for many of Malick's films, said, "Sometimes we'll be shooting something in a film and an interesting bird will fly by and he'll start crawling on a tree and directing the cameras toward that bird." One of the best sources we have for understanding how this style developed technically is Emmanuel Lubezki, or Chivo, someone who's arguably been responsible for a significant portion of the look we now think of as Terrence Malick. Malick's style was evolving during his first three films, and we can see many elements of his contemporary style in these early films, as I mentioned in my video essay about Badlands. But the first time we see what feels like his contemporary style fully formed is in The New World, which is where Malick and Chivo's collaboration began. In the lead up to working on The New World, Chivo and Malick established a dogma for shooting, a technical set of rules that guided how they would film things. These guidelines centered around the use of natural light, having as clear and high resolution an image as possible, and using fluid handheld or Steadicam movement most of the time. In a way, these elements are as much about what the image isn't as what it is. Malick's contemporary work is as much defined by the kinds of shots you will never see in them as it is by the ones you do. Why these rules though? Why this dogma? Is this just what Chivo and Malick thought would make the prettiest images? I don't think so. Here's Chivo illustrating the motivation behind the choice to use backlight. We chose backlight not because it is pretty, but because it helps with the evenness of the light. Terry shoots out of sequence. A close-up in October might be used on a scene later in December or somewhere else. By shooting backlight, keeping softer light on the face of the actors and keeping the sky white, we were able to serve the story and keep the continuity. Basically, Chivo is recognizing that Malick is assembling scenes from moments captured days or even months apart, and backlighting the characters looks good, but it also allows for a greater sense of continuity between these shots. I think many of the choices of technique are like this. For example, the choice of Steadicam or handheld cinematography. This certainly produces a specific aesthetic, but it also enables Malick and his actors to film in a unique way. Developing this approach involved an increasing focus on improvisation. With the use of natural light and the freedom of the camera, the actors were given freedom to walk and move wherever they liked. What started out as throwing out the script to use occasional improvisation on Thin Red Line in The New World eventually led to improvising entire films like The Knight of Cups. I would posit that this visual style developed mostly in an attempt to allow an increasing amount of freedom, something I point to in my essay about Nomadland and its style. This freedom would allow the filming to adapt to the way Malick wanted to work. Instead of having to halt everything to film a bird flying overhead, which would then need to be inserted into the scene later in editing, the camera could now easily shift its attention on the fly to incorporate the bird into the shot itself. As his films progressed, Malick became less and less interested in constructing and imposing narratives, often working with a technique called torpedoing, where he'd have several characters improvise a scene and on some takes would send in another character unannounced to disrupt the scene and force new kinds of improvisation. Christian Bale talks about falling asleep on the set of The New World and being awoken on camera and told to walk into the next room and start talking to somebody. Instead of writing scripts and then shooting them, Malick is using techniques like this to collect a large number of moments that he and his team of editors then use to shape into a finished film. This video focuses on why Terrence Malick's films look a certain way, but I must mention editing in the development of this look. The increasing level of freedom used in shooting these films was matched by an increasing level of freedom of association in the edit. There would be no point in capturing these drifting, fleeting improvisational moments if you weren't also developing a style of editing that allowed them to be used in the film. And this is what Malick did. At first incorporating improvisational moments and nature into the narrative as transitional pieces or parts of montages, but then shifting to making these moments the primary building blocks of his films. With The New World, where we see the first fully fledged example of his cinematography, we also see the adoption of a more impressionistic and non-continuity style of editing. While editing isn't an element of cinematography, it definitely affects how we feel a film looks to some degree. And I think the editing plays as much a role in Malick's distinct style as the cinematography does.
It seemed no trouble could reach our valley. We lived above the clouds.
But to say that Malick's style arose out of an increasing search for freedom and fluidity in production leaves another question unanswered. Why is this freedom important to Malick's filmmaking, and what is this freedom in service of? Malick in his films seems interested not just in putting on screen something that exists already in his imagination, but in starting with questions and setting out in search of an answer through the production of these films. Frequently in interviews with those who have worked with him, people mention searching for moments of truth. John C. Reilly, who appears in Thin Red Line, called Malick not a filmmaker, but a truth seeker.
You have food all over you.
For most of these later projects, Malick and his crew would shoot an immense amount of footage. Crew members would often remark that they had enough material from one film to create several different films. Through these images and moments, combined together with non-continuity editing, I think Malick's attempting to put on screen emotions, feelings, and ideas that are difficult to convey through traditional narrative structure and dialogue. Malick's more recent films largely employ non-continuity editing. While continuity editing, the style of editing that dominates most of the films and TV you watch, has a long history, non-continuity editing has a lesser known but still extensive past. Early Soviet directors like Sergei Eisenstein, who was working in the 1920s, were big proponents of non-continuity editing. Eisenstein believed that by removing the obvious spatial and temporal connection between one shot and the next, the filmmaker could force the audience to try to understand the connection themselves. It's these connections and associations between two seemingly unrelated images that create the potential to communicate deeper symbolic, philosophical, or emotional meanings through cinema. It's why cinema like Malick's is often described as poetic. Rather than using a conventional narrative focusing on plot, characters, exposition, and dialogue like a novel would, Malick's films use imagery, a kind of visual and thematic rhyming to evoke some essence or feeling like a poem would. There's a lot of people who don't like Malick's work. I think one reason why is because watching this kind of movie, like reading a poem, forces you to participate imaginatively in a way that some people find it hard to do or don't want to do. But another reason is that I think often things that are more poetic, like songs, can be more personal in terms of who they connect with. Appreciation of all art is subjective, but to enjoy Malick's work, you have to be interested in the sort of abstract emotional ideas he's presenting and the unusual approach he's taking to presenting them. But for those who do connect to his work, when they do, it seems to have profound impact. I, for one, think Malick's most interesting and engaging work comes from when he applies his searching, improvisational approach to the boundaries afforded by an existing story. A Hidden Life, which tells the true story of Franz Jägerstätter, an Austrian farmer who fought a quiet and personal battle against Nazi Germany, not only assembles an authentic representation of the world he lived in it, but gives us a glimpse into the interior struggle he and his community must have gone through. His search for answers in the story and Malick's search for answers align. The result is one of the most profound and engaging films I've ever seen and a personal favorite of mine. I think Malick's untraditional style is largely born out of his untraditional approach to film in general. He was willing to walk away from a successful career in film for 20 years after a growing frustration with Hollywood. And when he came back to filmmaking, he did it on his terms. He was willing to not play by the rules because he was willing to not play at all. And he refuses to speak for his work or offer explanations because both his approach and his work aren't ultimately about offering answers, but about the process of questioning. So why do Terrence Malick's films look like that? This video isn't a concrete answer. It's a document of my search for the answer to that question. And thank you for joining me in that search.